South Africa's responsible gambling journey, assessing progress, international perspectives, and new developments.
Let me introduce our incredible panel. We have our moderator, Jason Foster, the Managing Director of 1337 Pro Bet, Annalisa Samuels, the Product and Business Development Specialist at Bitville Holding, Robin Bennett, the Head of Department Regulatory Compliance at Western Cape Gambling and Racing Board, and Garron Whitesman, the founding partner of Whitesman Attorneys. Amazing panel. Guys, enjoy.
Thanks. I'll kick off in adding to those intros. So we've got Garron Whitesman, who I think has been a gaming lawyer before operators knew they needed gaming lawyers. Robin Bennett, who's had more than 20 years experience at the Western Cape Gambling Board. And Annalisa, more than 10 years experience in the industry. Very much focused on product development and business development. So for myself, I've probably spent the last 10 years more as a supplier to the industry, but I started out as a bookmaker in the bad old days with my first license in the early 90s when horse racing was the only game in town and there were no corporate bookmakers. And I think in those days, we wouldn't have used the slogan, winners know when to stop. It would have been more along the lines of, winners never quit, and quitters never win. So, Robin, can we start off with you? How have things moved on in South Africa?
Thanks, Jason. If we look at responsible gambling and how it progressed over the years, I think we can admit to ourselves that we're nowhere close to where we should be being. A lot of our focus in the past has been on at the rear end of problem gambling, which is the exclusion. So we've tried to do, even that itself has some limitations as well. In terms of responsible gambling, there has been some initiatives by license holders, but what we do believe is we need strong legislation in that respect. So that comes down to certain requirements that license holders have to impose for their customers, certain training that specifically must happen for the employees. Then we also got to look at the training, the awareness, and that would probably come from, let's say, the SARGF. They themselves do a lot of training and training for employees of license holders. They also do a lot of education and public awareness. So those type of things needs to start coming from the regulators as well. But I think what is important is that we got to have strong regulation when it comes to responsible gambling, whereby players, before they are onboarded with license holders, they are made aware of certain aspects, the dangers and harms that can be affected through problem gambling, as well as the benefits there are in terms of responsible gambling. I think it was during just after lockdown, it was during 2021, the lockdown restrictions basically created a breeding ground for potential problem gambling. And it's at that point in time that we realized that certain things needs to be done. Is we then commenced with the specific legislation we want to introduce, and it had been sent out to the industry for comment, and we hope to introduce it during the course of this year. The problem with these measures is that to those license holders who have sort of used the initiative by introducing certain measures when it was not regulated, is they would be able to deal with the measures that we are going to introduce. To other license holders who have just been oblivious in terms of introducing anything, it may be a bit of a shock to the system. But I do believe this is necessary because at the end of the day, it is the plain public that has been suffering from this. And with these measures, we do hope that we will reduce the number of people that transgress from a social gambler to a problem gambler or even a at-risk gambler.
Great, thanks. Garron, if I can go to you, you represent a lot of operators. Can you give us a bit of an operator's perspective on it?
Look, I think, the question of responsible gambling is one of the more tricky parts of the regulation of gambling. It's probably actually the most tricky part. I think whilst there are other issues that are complex, it's a question of almost a negotiation between regulators and operators. I mean, we're seeing what's happening in the UK at the moment with the UKGC and DCMS having out so-called winter or summer consultation papers. There's great doubt as to whether input from stakeholders is going to even influence that. You know, it's like anything. I mean, how far do you go negotiating against yourself as an operator as far as what responsible gambling measures are going to be imposed, balancing that with what a regulator is saying, which ultimately I think is where it's to be driven from, because I don't think operators are going to go as far as any regulator ever would, as well as commercial imperatives of operators, because in my experience, problem gamblers are actually a commercial problem in many senses as well for operators who actually would rather avoid having a problem gambler ultimately. Maybe not initially when there's a lot being lost to the bookmaker, but ultimately, invariably, it comes back to bite you in some way or another with refunds of monies or complaints or court cases. Often the amounts involved are just nowhere near, quite frankly, compelling enough to go through the later hassle. So I think it's a big balancing act, and it's not really ever going to be driven, in my view at least, by the industry. You know, then the question, of course, is when you start imposing these things, well, greater rules, greater restrictions, what's the balance to be achieved? And, I mean, it's something which we can either address now or a little bit later, but we're certainly seeing, and it would be interesting to certainly hear Robin's perspective on it as well, we're certainly seeing some pretty drastic measures that have been imposed over the last couple of years in different jurisdictions around the world.
Great, thanks. It's interesting that you say it's a commercial issue for operators. So perhaps that's something for Annalisa to address.
That's just my view. I mean,
side.
the operator may say something different.
Because obviously, yes, it's there's a balance, and Robin, I'll come back to you on how we manage that balance. But Annalisa, how do we go beyond self-exclusion?
Well, I was actually discussing it with you earlier, and I was thinking about how operators can strike some sort of balance in trying to get, responsible gambling kicked off and sort of manage it from an operational perspective. And look, there's a great movement towards managing the information that we have within the systems and sort of plotting behavior when it comes to players and what's happening with the player. So yes, there's a lot of information in the systems currently, and a lot can be gathered in terms of information and what a player is doing. But then again, it's not really the operator's responsibility as a whole to manage the player. And then there's a lot but there is a lot of information in the system. So there is room to develop and create software that can actually pick up trends when it comes to players. I was also thinking perhaps we can categorize and look at risk when it comes to players. So a player that is onboarded can actually be analyzed, and you can actually give the guy a questionnaire and figure out how high risk that player is when it comes to problem gambling, because everything is psychological. I mean, a player that has a propensity to be a problem gambler normally has triggers, and that can be picked up. So initially, when a player is taken on, you can track whether that player is prone to problem gambling. Right now, there's no bet limit set. So you can gamble your whole salary, and there's no restriction on it. So these are things that can lead to, well, one is prevention, but the fact that we don't have any bet limits in place or capping when it comes to how much you can spend is a problem. So there's little things that we can put in place currently that can curb problem gambling. A player can set his own limit. We don't have to set that limit for the player, but a player can be responsible for his own spending. Remember, problem gambling is a psychological thing. You may have a problem today. I mean, bipolar disorder, for example, leads to problem gambling. You may not be bipolar in this very moment. Mania leads to problem gambling. So I may have bipolar disorder, but I may get into a manic state. And that manic state may lead to me having a problem gambling phase in my life. But I need to get to that point where I'm in mania when that happens. But there are triggers. And when that happens, I can be stopped before it happens. And deposits, a lot of deposits going through my account, if that's picked up, that will show that I'm going into a downward spiral. So there are behavioral patterns of a player that can be picked up in time to stop that player. Self-exclusions is not necessarily the answer, but before a player goes into a downward spiral, we can pick up a trend. Also, when it comes to payment gateways, you can make 100 deposits at the same time and there's no restriction. Perhaps looking at how many deposits is feasible. You know, what is a rational number of deposits at one time? If I'm making 50 deposits in one night, is it really responsible? Should I be making 20 deposits? If my salary is 2,000 Rand a month, how many deposits should I be making? I'm not a millionaire. Let's be practical about this. I mean, we should be able to gamble as much as we want to, but let's be realistic about this. Let's make it available to everyone, but let's be practical about how we're making these things available. So I'm saying there's a lot of open areas here that we need to look at, and we need to just circumvent the risk, so to speak. And I think then we should be fine. But right now, it's just open-ended.
Great, thanks. Robin, do you want to chip in with some perspective? You know, in the UK, we've seen more and more restrictions on operators. So single account views, stake limits, affordability checks, that sort of thing. Operators have complied with it, but let's say we're not necessarily fully on board. Where do you see South Africa going in the future, and is there a reasonable balance between the regulator and operator?
Thanks, Jason. I think it's important that whenever we're going to introduce new types of legislation is there has to be a balance between what objective the regulator is trying to achieve compared to the objectives of the license holder. And we've got to remember something, a license holder there, it is a business at the end of the day. Yes, we do understand problem gambling is a consequence of legalized gambling. So what do we have to do in terms of finding that balance? First of all is we got to guard against over-regulation. Over-regulation is not going to help anyone in that aspect. It's got to be helpful for the board, it's not going to be helpful for the player, it's not going to be helpful for the regulators. When you have to over-regulate, it could result in either license holders not being able to comply, either they have to close their doors, or it becomes so onerous basically to them is they look at other methods to try to operate. You could also find that it could be a frustrating place to the extent where they seek the illegal market. Okay, so but regulation is important. We've come to the stage where any measures or any initiative for responsible gambling can no longer be at the discretion of operators. There has to be a regulation on that. Over and above the regulation that you are going to have is license holders can basically put their own initiatives in there. And I think regulators, to a certain extent, need to recognize license holders who have certain initiatives regarding responsible gambling. I mean, we don't really get that, but if a plain member of the public should phone the board and say, well, who do they recommend basically should they go play at, with which operator? We cannot favor one operator over the next but if we do know is that license holder A offers certain responsible gambling measures that really reduces the chances of a person become a problem gambler, those are things that we probably could mention in our annual report or something like that, because you do want to give recognition to license holders. I also don't believe that license holders are basically opposed to responsible gambling measures. I think any license holder, they're looking for three things when it comes to legislation. Firstly, it needs to be reasonable and practical. Secondly, there needs to be expectation certainty. And thirdly, there must be consistency with enforcement. When it comes to reasonable and practicalness, that is things that we introduce. We've got to understand the operations that they are running. We've got to understand the needs of the persons, and we do through consultation. So from that point of view, I think we're always going to be reasonable and practical. Yes, it might not be reasonable and practical for all, but it will be generally that for the public, for the industry. Then in terms of expectation certainty, everybody must be certain exactly what the expectations is from that regulations. Then no one's going to have a problem. And thirdly, more important is there must be consistency with enforcement, meaning that what you apply to one license holder must be applied to that. So I think if you've got those three principles, basically, in terms of the regulations, we shouldn't have any issues with that. Having started, I did indicate that we're nowhere close to where we're supposed to be with responsible gambling. However, this might not be the right time to just throw everything down the throats of the regulators. Some things are going to be a bit drastic now, perhaps maybe with limits or player interventions or identifying certain things. And what Annalisa has mentioned in terms of software that can do these things for operators is, unfortunately, those type of things would have to come in, and it'd have to come in via legislation. Because you don't want to leave that up to the discretion of license holders, because then you create a bit of an unlevel playing fields, where some license holders will introduce it and others basically will not. So we are going to consistently try to achieve that balance, bearing in mind is what the overall objective of an operator is as well. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Got a bit of a slightly more detailed question. We spoke about this before, but you know, there's a bit of an arms race on at the moment between operators. We know it's massively complicated massively competitive in South Africa, with 50 or more operators. And one of the ways in which certainly newer operators compete is with deposit bonuses. Are deposit bonuses, well, maybe we can start with you, Garron. Deposit bonuses such as deposit 5,000 Rand, get 5,000 Rand, with the terms that are applied to them, that you have to turn over that amount 10 times, does that not encourage or increase problem gambling?
Sure, good question. Yeah, look, I think the playthrough requirements is something that's just been around for a long time in the industry, and certainly those operators who have traditionally had a casino background as well. You know, one saw that very, very strongly 20 years ago, 15 years ago coming through, with substantial bonuses, play-through requirements, and restrictions on what you could withdraw, you know, based on those promos. Look, you've got to be able to get people in, and you've got to be able to compete effectively, and it is difficult. I mean, how else do you really get people through the door? I mean, I think we also have to be cognizant of Section 15.3 of the National Gambling Act, which says that you may not promote or advertise gambling at a discount or for free as an inducement to gamble. And those restrictions, and I know there's been some tension over the years between, say, Robin's board, Gauteng board, and some of the other boards relating to you know, non-Western Cape operators offering quite substantial buy-get offers or free money offers. So I think you have to be able to advertise your wares. You have to be able to bring in people. Am I in favor ever of silly terms that are inappropriate for consumers? No. I could never ascribe to those or agree to those. But by the same token, I don't think one has a choice, but within reason, to be able to incentivize players on an acquisition basis.
Yeah. No, great. We've only got 5 minutes left. So, yeah, Robin, do you want to wrap up? Have you got anything to add to what Garron said, or any other subject that you'd like to talk about?
In terms of what Garron said is, the promotions at the moment, we do see it a bit of an issue. No license holder has literally basically transgressed anything in terms of offering the promotions, because the board does approve these promotions. We are currently busy with a study relating to problem gambling, and we have asked our researchers to include that aspect in there about the types of promotions that that license holders offer the the punters, and hopefully once we get that information, we will look at perhaps changing things. There has been one or two instances that we've had coming to our office where people claim is that they've been induced to gamble as a result of that. But that's been only one or two. It's not the general concept in terms of that. In terms of the advertising of license holders, I think that is actually very important. License holders are licensed. They pay their taxes, they pay their fees, they are allowed to advertise their business. And another thing about license holders is that when they advertise that is for the plain public to know that these are licensed entities as opposed to illegal entities. So licensing is very important. And it's just probably the type of advertising that sometimes get done that the board has to look at a bit more closely.
Yeah, I think there have been some moves in places like the UK to restrict advertising of gambling operators on Premier League team shirts, that sort of thing. We do seem to be going a little bit the other way here in South Africa. Annalisa, for your wrap-up, do you think that problem gambling is going to become an increasing issue in South Africa? Obviously we've seen massive growth in the industry year after year. Are we just seeing the same proportion of problem gambling on a bigger audience, or is this becoming more of a problem?
I actually think that with online gambling, we might see a bit of the reverse happening, because I think banks and institutions are becoming more aware of the effect of online gambling on, or the spend on disposable income. So, for example, if I'm gambling online, all my transactions are going through my bank account, which means that if I'm applying for a bond or if I'm applying for credit, those transactions are there on my bank statement when I go to apply for credit, which means that now the banks are more aware that a person is spending money on a regular basis, which means even though they're saying that it doesn't affect your disposable income, they're aware that you're spending that money and they're querying it, which means that myself as an individual is more aware that if I'm spending that money and I'm trying to obtain credit, I need to be aware that that's going to go against my disposable income spend. So it might have a positive impact on how people are spending their money on gambling, especially in the online space. That's one. So that could be a positive in terms of people being more responsible with how much they spend in the online gambling space futuristically. Because everything is connected, the bureaus are connected, and the banks are connected, and everything is transparent. So you will see a trend towards banking institutions and taking this into consideration as one of something that people are actually spending on a regular basis and fixing it, and saying this is an allocation of money that people are using. And I think that's going to happen really soon. I also think that, yes, as much as people are going to be gambling more in the online space, I think more is going to be done to make people more aware of what they of problem gambling, and eventually it's going to level off.
Great. Garron, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think, certain of the things that Robin said about the creation of legislation and those things that are important, or regulations, is absolutely bang on. We look at who's got to make the rules, how, what are the stakeholder inputs. The reality is the reason why a lot of, the bookmakers or online casinos, online books in the UK are imposing such drastic RG and affordability and social responsibility restrictions is because, quite frankly, they're scared of losing their licenses and going through a 116 license inquiry, as well as getting, absolutely substantial and huge fines. It's the same in Sweden, it's the same in the Netherlands. I think, and I would hope that when we do bring in additional rules here, that it's a more balanced approach, and that, you know, it's done within the context of a regulatory trust, as I term it, that is created between the operators and the regulators and operators, where they can trust each other to do sensible things, to be able to sensibly operate in a sensible way.
Great, thanks, guys. I think time is up.
Amazing.
Great
A big round of applause for our incredible panel, everyone.